Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. What does 2019 hold for Luis Ortiz, the longtime contender from Cuba, who's closing in on 40 and seemingly at the back end, the twilight of his career? Potentially he's only got 1 or 2 more good years left of him as an elite fighter, so he's got to choose carefully, pick his course in the division carefully, because if he doesn't, he could be on the outside looking in faster than we think. And there had been some talk about Joyce, a potential fight with a British prospect, but I'm just not so convinced. But let's go through all the options, because I believe there is an option out there where he is title bound in 2019. It may not be completely obvious on the surface, but I believe it will come to the fore quite quickly. Buckle in. Let's go. Let's get to this option of this title shot first, because I think there is a case where once the fight between Anthony Joshua and Dillian Whyte is confirmed, and I believe it will be, that puts Luis Ortiz squarely in contention for a title fight, an interim title fight with Dominic Breazeale. There's a few cards that need to fall before that could happen, but I think what we will see is Anthony Joshua and Dillian Whyte confirmed sometime in mid to later January, somewhere between the 15th and 20th of January. Then after that, I believe what will happen is negotiations between Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury will continue. Eventually, they will announce a rematch sometime for mid-year, maybe June. Obviously, they're sort of going back and forth through the media, promoters saying bits and pieces about a fight potentially in the UK or elsewhere. It'll go where the money is. But if Tyson Fury can wrangle home advantage in the UK, they will certainly try to do that. But once that situation is resolved, because remember, Breazeale is the mandatory challenger, there is a resolution that will be created. And in that, they will deal with Dominic Breazeale's mandatory status. He's been the mandatory for a year. And if Dillian Whyte, the number one contender in the WBC, is spoken for, he's got his own title fight with Anthony Joshua. Well, who is Johnny on the spot? Luis Ortiz. And I believe Dominic Breazeale and Luis Ortiz, at this point in time, if Whyte faces Joshua, that will be for some sort of interim strap in the WBC. So it's no surprise to me that some of the talk of a fight with Joyce has died down recently. There was a lot of talk of that pre and post the December 1st card in Los Angeles, where Joyce fought Joe Hanks and Ortiz fought Travis Kauffman. Both stopped their men, Hanks in half a round by Joyce, and Kauffman, he was battered for 10 rounds and stopped by Luis Ortiz late on. But there was a lot of talk that that fight would happen, it would be the next. There was a lot of speculation that with Al Heyman coming to the United Kingdom, that could be a good UK fight for Ortiz and Joyce to fight and, help fatten out a card there. Eventually that could potentially happen, but I don't believe it is going to be the next fight. Because I think Luis Ortiz, as I said, I laid out the case earlier, back end of his career, he's looking for money, he's looking for big opportunities. A Joyce fight, it makes some sense, but really in terms of a potential purse and prestige, and it's all upside for Joyce. Whereas for Luis Ortiz, if he loses to a rising prospect, although Joyce is kind of a contender in disguise, where does he go after that? Because a lot of people would go, you're done. So Luis Ortiz, I believe they're waiting to see where the chips may fall before making their next move. And that could be for an interim shot against Dominic Breazeale. I believe that is the most likely option. And that may not please some Joyce fans, because obviously Ortiz had accepted the call out from Joyce. But at the end of the day, they will go with the titles, the prestige, the money, wherever they can get the most of any of that sort of stuff. And you can't blame them after all. They're prize fighters, and some of it too is about legacy and maximizing, their revenue, their earning potential, but also the big fights for the time that they're left in the sport. And Luis Ortiz's case, we just don't know how long he's got left in the sport. So Ortiz, I believe, the number one option that they will look for, and they will know is coming down the pipe potentially if Whyte faces Joshua and a rematch between Fury and Wilder gets made, is that Breazeale fight. He will be ready, willing, and waiting. But say for whatever reason it doesn't happen. Say, there's a shock in the division in terms of potential matchups, and Dillian Whyte ends up facing Dominic Breazeale for whatever reason. Say Deontay Wilder ends up fighting Anthony Joshua, however unlikely that is at this point. Or Tyson Fury decides to sit for some time, so Wilder and Breazeale have to fight. What then for Luis Ortiz? Well, obviously, there's the Joyce option to fall back on. It's a decent fight. There's some who don't really rate Ortiz. They think he's slowing down, getting older. He was gassing a bit later on in the Wilder fight. His legs maybe aren't what they once were. But at the same time, Joyce, he is seen as a little bit slow and lumbering, but he does punch like a mule. So it's an interesting matchup for many reasons. And Luis Ortiz with his counter-punching, he could really wreck him with a straight left hand down the pipe. We saw that again with Travis Kauffman. He wrecked Razvan Kajanu in 2018 with that punch. And Joyce, he's been stopped before in the amateurs. So it's an interesting fight for many reasons. But if that one isn't there, or say, for example, it happens down the line, what next for Luis Ortiz? There has been quite a bit of speculation among fans that, is he, a guy that could face Alexander Povetkin? Is he a guy that could face Alexander Usyk? There seems to be a lot of speculation that, his name is in the mix for some of these fights. I'm not so convinced about the Usyk one. I don't think he would want that level of risk, Usyk that is, at this point, moving up to heavyweight. I could see him taking a bit of a softer touch, for his first, 1 or 2 fights. He's going to raise through the levels. So I'm not convinced that a Usyk fight is really there. And an Alexander Povetkin and a Luis Ortiz fight, that's got a lot of interest for me. A couple of the elder statesmen and that's not meant to be a derogatory sort of term either, but a couple of the elder statesmen of the division, guys who've been there, done that, got the postcard, they've been hanging around the division for about 10 years or so, even more in Povetkin's case. That would be a very interesting fight. Both, relatively decorated, seasoned amateurs, seasoned professionals. Povetkin has a deeper resume than Ortiz, but it doesn't mean that, Ortiz can't beat Povetkin. Very even matchup in my view. Both good technicians, both aren't massive guys. Obviously, Ortiz would have the height and the reach advantage in that one. It'd be a very interesting contest. Both are very good inside fighters, both are very good counter-punchers. It's got a lot of tasty elements to that fight. Maybe it's more of a fantasy matchup, maybe it can't be made. But if we look at other options out there, if a Joyce fight isn't there, if a Dominic Breazeale interim title fight isn't there, if a Usyk fight, a Povetkin fight, if they're not options, where next? For me, I don't want to see any more treading water fights for Luis Ortiz. And that was the situation that he was in for most of 2018 after the fight with Deontay Wilder. That was a great fight, one of the fights of the year in terms of the heavyweight division, sort of the drama and the intrigue, and it was a 50-50. Deontay Wilder's first true step-up fight in terms of a guy that people thought could beat him. And you had Luis Ortiz almost coming through to become the WBC champion. But after that, it was a bit of a down year. He was meant to face Joe Hanks, and Hanks pulled out. That was in July. Razvan Kajanu steps in. It wasn't a fight people wanted to see him in. He took care of him as he should have, because, Razvan Kajanu can play spoiler, and he did that against Nathan Gorman recently. He did that against Joseph Parker. But Luis Ortiz wasn't having any of it. Wrecked him with a straight left hand. And then obviously we had the Kauffman fight. It was another fight where Luis Ortiz, heavily favoured to win, didn't really want to see him in that sort of fight. So I hope that he's not sort of spinning his wheels for the first 6 to 9 months of this year, if other bigger options aren't available and he's forced to take some of these stay busies. At this point in his career, and I don't want to keep harking on about it, but he is approaching 40, potentially older from what some people say. We want to see him in the biggest fights. For quite a big portion of Luis Ortiz's career, he struggled to get fights. People haven't wanted to fight him. He's just a little bit too dangerous. He's been in that sort of no man's land where, up-and-comers don't want to face him. The top contenders generally have either fought other guys or avoided call-outs. And Luis Ortiz has kind of, had to make do. But now he's in the PBC stable under Al Heyman. There's a bit more oomph and leverage to get him some of the bigger fights. We've seen that with the Wilder fight. As soon as he signed with Al Heyman, he got the title shot. But since then, he's kind of been spinning his wheels. The Joyce option is there, but I would actually quite like to see, if he can't get any of these other fights I've already mentioned, and some of the other ones like a Povetkin, Usyk sort of fight, what about someone like a Charles Martin? if you look at the PBC stable, there's a couple of guys on there that you could go, okay, they're not booked up at this point. You've got Kanelski in Washington later in January. You've got a couple of other guys who are going to be fighting. Potentially, Wilder's going to be out of action with a rematch. So you look at the stable, there's a number of guys on there that you go, okay, what about that guy? And one of them for me is Charles Martin. Charles Martin is certainly more than a Razvan Kajanu or a Travis Kauffman stay busy. He represents a lot of risk. Adam Kanelski found out last time out when Kanelski started to gas that Charles Martin can keep banging and keep fighting, and he can, put it on you. So it'd be interesting to see, two southpaws as well, Ortiz and Charles Martin. I think that would be quite a good fight if he, to fall back on if there is no other options. They've got a number of cards coming up, up to about April. If they announce something shortly, if other options don't happen, well, that could be quite a good fight. But yeah, just a few thoughts on Luis Ortiz, because I'd like to see this guy busy and active, and I do believe he probably will get that interim title shot with Dominic Breazeale, but it's boxing, nothing is guaranteed. Often, things come out of left field and we get surprised. I mean, who saw that Joseph Parker and Dillian White fight coming? A few other options, are out there for Luis Ortiz, but I think for the moment they will just wait, watch, see what happens with other dominoes to fall in the division before making a move. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.